But again, a lot of people protesting, the vast majority of them peaceful, but they're also in many cases angry. In 1995, a conservative policy wonk named John DiIulio came up with this idea: the coming of the super predators. It was meant to sound scary, and it was. Quote, on the horizon are tens of thousands of severely morally impoverished juvenile super predators. They are perfectly capable of committing the most heinous acts of physical violence for the most trivial reasons. For example, a perception of slight disrespect or the accident of being in their path. They fear neither the stigma of arrest nor the pain of imprisonment. They live by the meanest code of the meanest streets, a code that reinforces rather than restrains their violent hair-trigger mentality. Scary, right? John DiIulio, 1995, said there was probably no way out of this super predator hell that awaited us as a nation, because he said it was demographically inevitable. Some people, you know who you are just destined from birth to be this monstrous. It's inescapable, demographically speaking. DiIulio said this, quote, Americans are sitting on a demographic crime bomb. The next wave of homicidal and near-homicidal violence among urban youth is bound to reach adjacent neighborhoods, inner-ring suburbs, and even the rural heartland. This crime bomb, he said, probably cannot be diffused. The large population of 7 to 10-year-old boys, now growing up fatherless, godless, and jobless, and surrounded by deviant, delinquent, and criminal adults, will give rise to a new and more vicious group of predatory street criminals than the nation has ever known. We must therefore be prepared to contain the explosion's force and limit its damage. That was John DiIulio writing in 1995, which was during the Clinton administration. When George W. Bush became the next president, he named John DiIulio to be the first director of the Office of Faith-Based Outreach in the White House. But meanwhile, in part because of the DiIulio theory about teenage super predators that could be predicted at age 7, the states started locking up tens of thousands of kid criminals in adult prisons, sometimes for life. America really took seriously this prediction about the super predator crime bomb. It was very scary stuff, right, in theory, about our coming nation of hair-trigger, vacant-eyed, remorseless young super predators. He said it was about to happen. You could tell it was about to, demographically, it was a time bomb. It didn't actually happen. Here's the juvenile arrest rate for murder into the early 1990s, right, going up there. John DiIulio starts writing about the coming wave of violent, juvenile, godless super predators. He starts writing about that in 1995. And then his very racialized, very scary predictions for worse violence coming just over the horizon, they did not pan out. And then ultimately, John DiIulio took it back. In a court filing just a couple of years ago, John DiIulio finally expressed regret for what he had written back in the 90s. He signed a brief saying that he'd been wrong when he predicted a murderous future for all those 7-year-old boys he was so afraid of. Sorry about the whole super predator thing. Sorry to all those kids now doing life in adult prison. But it turned out the glassy-eyed, afraid of nothing, superhuman, monstrous American juvenile super predator was just a racial fantasy. Yesterday in Missouri, with the news that a grand jury had decided not to indict Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, the St. Louis County prosecutor released the documents that were seen by the grand jury and that were generated by that grand jury proceeding. As part of that, we got to see the grand jury testimony of Officer Darren Wilson. For the first time, we got to see Officer Wilson's description of what happened in his encounter with 18-year-old Michael Brown. This encounter that left Michael Brown lying dead in the street, with 12 bullets expended from Officer Wilson's gun in the process. After Officer Wilson fired his first bullet, he describes Mr. Brown as looking at him with, quote, the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, he told the grand jury, quote, it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. Officer Wilson testified that Michael Brown was huge. He told the grand jury, quote, I mean, he's obviously bigger than I was and stronger. Now, it is true that Michael Brown was a big guy. 18 years old, he stood 6'4", he weighed 290 pounds. Darren Wilson himself also stands 6'4", although he's not quite as heavy as Michael Brown. Darren Wilson is not a small guy, 6'4", 210. But faced with what he describes as a demonic-seeming young man, a young man he called it to the grand jury, Darren Wilson basically said he felt like a toy, he felt like a little kid in that actual kids' presence. This is how it appeared in the transcript of his grand jury testimony. He said, quote, "When I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. That's just how big he felt and how small I felt just from grasping his arm." That's the way he said it to the grand jury, according to the transcript. And then tonight, in an interview with ABC News, Darren Wilson said it again.
I had reached out my window with my right hand to grab onto his forearm because I was going to try and move him back and get out of the car to where I'm no longer trapped. And when I felt it, I just felt the immense power that he had. I mean, the way I've described it is it was like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. That's just how big this man was. Hulk Hogan, he was very large, very powerful man.
You're a pretty big guy.
Yeah, I'm above average.
He's 6'4", armed, a trained police officer, inside a police car. The 18-year-old he says he struggled with is also 6'4", but to the officer he seemed like Hulk Hogan, and the officer comparatively was a child. To the officer, that young man seemed like a demon. He told the grand jury that after he started shooting 18-year-old Michael Brown, the officer said he kept shooting further shots at him because of the way Michael Brown looked to him after he started shooting him. He said the teenager, after he had been shot, looked like he, quote, he was almost bulking up to run through the shots. Like it was making him mad that I'm shooting at him. Bulking up to run through the shots. Officer Darren Wilson was afraid for his life, he says. He said that was his defense. He thought he had met Hulk Hogan, a larger-than-life threat that he could stop only by shooting. And even then, this demon that he saw would keep going through the shots by somehow bulking himself up to make himself immune to the shots because he was so angered by them. Gunfire only made it angry, this demon. We are 2 decades out from the super predator panic from the mid-90s. We now know that was just a racial fantasy that nevertheless drove a lot of policy and changed a lot of people's lives. The fact that it was 2 decades ago and there's been an apology since doesn't mean that fantasy is gone, or that it's not still driving our judgment and our accountability.